Matthew drove them to a nice restaurant that Julia was quite familiar with. She had been there several times before. It was Matthew's favorite restaurant, the same place where she used to pick up his lunch and breakfast when she worked for him at the company. Being in a familiar environment made Julia feel more comfortable. Most of the employees there knew her, and she knew a few as well. As Julia and Matthew walked in, many employees and customers immediately turned to look at them. They had clearly attracted a lot of attention. Julia understood why. She was dressed in a basic maid's uniform, while Matthew was suited up, looking attractive and regal. The difference between the two of them was like night and day. Matthew led the way, and Julia followed him to an empty table they soon occupied. Julia wondered whether Matthew would be fine being seen with her, but he didn't seem to mind, so she decided not to think much of it. She kept looking around suspiciously, making sure she wasn't caught off guard by any tricks. She strongly believed he had a sinister reason for bringing her here. After a few minutes, a waiter approached them and asked if they would like to place an order or if there was anything else they needed. Matthew said he didn't want anything and asked the waiter to take Julia's order instead. Julia's alarm bells rang. Didn't he say he wanted to go out to eat? Wasn't that the whole reason they were here? Why wasn't he ordering anything? What was he up to now? Julia immediately responded, saying she had already eaten lunch and was very satisfied. I know you've already had lunch. I watched you eating my meal. You don't have to order food. You can get any beverage or dessert, he suggested. Julia wanted to refuse, but this was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, and they were known for their acclaimed desserts. She really wanted to try some, but there was no way she would spend a fortune on a bowl of ice cream, especially not from her own pocket. And there was no way Matthew would pay for her. There's no need. I didn't bring any money with me, she said. In case it isn't obvious, the bill is on me. So, you can order whatever you want, Matthew explained. Julia's ears immediately perked up. She obviously didn't trust Matthew, but why pass up a delicious snack over it? She stared at Matthew for a while before turning to the waiter, who was still waiting for her order. I hope you heard him clearly. He said he will handle the bill. You heard that, right? Julia asked. The waiter, looking a bit confused, nodded in agreement. I'm glad you heard him. Now go and tell every other employee here that he said my bill is on him. So, in case I make an order and he runs away, I don't want anyone holding me responsible. I will not make any payments. He has said it's his responsibility, Julia emphasized, pointing directly at Matthew. The waiter looked completely baffled, unsure how to react. He kept glancing between Julia and Matthew, feeling like an intruder in their exchange. Matthew, amused by Julia's antics, gave the waiter a small nod of affirmation, allowing him to regain his professionalism. The waiter then told Julia exactly what she wanted to hear, that he would make sure everyone knew her boss was covering the bill. Everyone in the city knew the Wendell family. Affording a simple dessert was child's play for them. Although they didn't understand why Julia was dressed as a maid, they recognized her as Matthew's personal assistant. After receiving the confirmation she wanted, Julia ordered the largest bowl of vanilla ice cream and immersed herself in enjoying it. Matthew still hadn't ordered anything. He just watched her silently. Sir, are you sure you don't want to order anything? There's no way we came all the way here just for me to have dessert, Julia said after realizing that Matthew truly had no plans of ordering anything. He was just staring at her, and it was weird.
Why?
Can I take you out? He asked. Julia looked at him for a moment before bursting into laughter. At the peak of her amusement, she noticed the company driver Matthew had given Mrs. Christine's car keys to earlier. The driver was supposed to take the car back to the house, so what was he doing here? The driver walked up to them and handed a package to Matthew. It seemed like Matthew had been expecting him. After their brief exchange, the driver left, and Matthew took out the item from the bag. Julia could not believe her eyes. It was a package of food. The container looked very familiar. The moment Matthew opened it and started eating, Julia was completely shocked. This was one of the extra meals she had prepared just in case Matthew rejected the first one. She had kept it in the car trunk. Matthew had indeed rejected the food she originally brought for him, claiming he didn't want any food that had been kept in a car. So, Julia had decided to eat one of the meals herself and left the rest in the trunk. But now, here was Matthew, eating the very same food he had refused. Julia just sat there, staring in shock as Matthew ate. Didn't he say he didn't want food that had been transported in a car? Why was he enjoying it now? And why, of all places, would he come to the best restaurant in town just to eat the meal she prepared? She didn't know how to feel about it. Matthew didn't even order a drink. He took the passion fruit juice she had prepared along with his meal. Julia also wondered whether it was even allowed to bring outside food into this restaurant. But even if it was against the rules, she doubted anyone would hold Matthew accountable. She had so many questions but couldn't bring herself to ask any. She didn't know whether to be angry that he was eating the so-called contaminated food he had ridiculed her for, or to be glad that he was choosing her simple meal over his favorite restaurant's food. Either way, she didn't understand what he was up to. So, she kept quiet. After leaving the restaurant, Matthew drove deeper into the city, causing Julia's senses to heighten again. Sir, where are we going? I thought you said you'd drive me back to the house, Julia said. Matthew didn't respond. He just kept driving until they reached his desired destination. Julia was confused when she saw where he had taken them, the mall. It would be understandable if he wanted to buy something for himself, but this particular mall was primarily for women. It was the most prestigious ladies' mall in the city. Why had Matthew brought her here, of all places? Matthew got out of the car, but Julia made no move to follow him. Why aren't you getting out of the car? Matthew asked. Sir, why are we at this mall? Do you need my help choosing a gift for someone? Julia inquired. Get out of the car and follow me, he ordered before walking off. Julia hesitated but eventually got out of the car and followed him into the store. Matthew was acting really weird today, and Julia felt like she was walking straight into a trap. Once they got in, Julia stood next to Matthew and waited as she looked around. This place was every woman's dream. Many of the customers and shop attendants were staring at the unusual duo, a handsome, regal man and a simple maid, just like the people in the restaurant had. But Julia barely noticed this because her eyes were fixated on the different aisles of luxury designer accessories. Every woman would love to shop here, but for many, like Julia, it would only ever be a dream. The cheapest item here was worth an average worker's monthly income or more. You can go ahead and take anything you want, Matthew said, noticing Julia's mesmerized expression as she looked around the store. Julia turned to Matthew after hearing this. Now, this was an offer she didn't want to reject. She just didn't want to pay for it. Will you pay for whatever I pick? Julia asked, hope swelling in her heart, though she tried her best not to come off as desperate. Of course, I'm paying. It's not like you can afford anything here without exhausting your entire life savings, he mocked. But Julia wasn't offended. He could mock her all he wanted as long as he paid for whatever she picked. She didn't want to waste this chance, but she remained on high alert. Maybe he had failed to trap her at the restaurant, so he was trying to do it at the mall instead. But it wouldn't work. Boldly, Julia grabbed Matthew's arm and pulled him toward the main checkout counter, where several mall attendants were stationed. They were the people she wanted to make a point to. She greeted the attendants and quickly introduced Matthew to them. This is my boss. His name is Matthew Wendell, and he said that I can pick anything I want in the store and that he will pay for it all, Julia announced loud enough for all the attendants to hear. Matthew just watched her in amusement. Her lack of trust in him was truly overwhelming. The mall workers looked confused but maintained their professionalism despite their bewilderment. Julia continued. So, since he has given me the green light, I'm going to pick a few things. Just in case he runs away or refuses to pay, I will not be held accountable. I will get to keep all the things I take from the store, and you people will call the police on him, not me. I will even willingly give you his address. Without waiting for their response, Julia eagerly dashed deeper into the mall, disappearing in seconds. The attendants didn't even know what to say. They were just as confused as the waiter in the restaurant earlier. Matthew reassured them and promised to handle the bill, just as Julia had said. Given his wealth, no one doubted his ability to pay. After that, Matthew followed Julia into the store. Julia went completely wild. This was every girl's dream. She was elated. Imagine being able to pick anything you want and not having to pay for it. This was a first for her. She felt like this was her retribution for everything she had gone through, and she planned to take full advantage of it. She deserved it. All those months of torture had to be worth something. She would make sure to put a dent in Matthew's bank account the best she could. She moved from aisle to aisle, grabbing everything that caught her attention. High-end clothes of different styles, shoes, bags, jewelry, and anything else she liked. Matthew and some attendants followed behind, carrying the growing pile of things she selected. People in the store watched in awe and shock. Out of all the affluent customers in the store, it was a simple maid who was the biggest shopper, and a handsome, regal man was following her around, carrying her things. Many women in the store were envious and jealous of Julia. They kept sneaking glances at her and whispering amongst themselves. But Julia was too preoccupied to notice, and Matthew simply didn't care. It took a while for the mall employees to calculate and pack up all the things Julia had chosen. She was shocked to see Matthew pay for everything without a single word of protest. She was honestly loving whatever game he was playing. So many people in the store who witnessed this were envious. The shop attendants' admiration for Matthew grew. Everyone wished they were Julia. Some even voiced their doubts about her being just as maid. They pointed out how softly he looked at her. As Julia and Matthew left the mall, various debates erupted about their relationship. Matthew's car was completely packed with shopping bags. Just as he had promised, he drove Julia home. He even helped her unload all her new things before leaving for the company. Julia spent the entire evening unpacking and trying on different outfits. This was the most she had ever received in her life. She was so happy. It all felt like a dream, and she didn't want to wake up from it. This new version of Matthew was one she had never seen before, and she didn't want to deal with the old, rude one ever again. Matthew had already stopped Julia from using his mother's car to go to the office and asked her to walk instead. That was absurd. She didn't even want to use public transport multiple times like she used to, let alone walk. So she came up with a perfect plan. Matthew was fully dressed for work in the morning when he received a call. He was a little confused to see Julia's name on the screen. Why would she call him when they were in the same house? He answered the call, and a weak voice spoke through. It was Julia, explaining that she was very sick and weak. She apologized, saying she wouldn't be able to prepare any of his meals today, much less take them to him at the company. Matthew listened without saying a word and then ended the call. Immediately, he walked downstairs to Julia's bedroom. He knocked and entered. As expected, Julia was curled up in bed. She looked over at Matthew, who was already dressed for work. He asked if she needed anything, offering to get her some medicine, call a doctor, or even drive her to the hospital. But Julia quickly turned down all his suggestions. She said she just needed to rest, and that she would be fine with time. Deep down, she just wished Matthew would leave already. She didn't understand why he was trying to be helpful. Matthew silently stood in the room for a while, staring at Julia before walking out. She was so relieved to see him leave. For a moment, she had feared he had seen through her tricks. Julia then listened carefully, hoping to hear Matthew's car drive out, so she could enjoy her day without having to go anywhere. After an unusually long wait, instead of hearing his car start, she heard her bedroom door open again. Matthew walked in, dressed in casual clothes and holding a bowl of water and some towels. Julia was completely shocked. She didn't understand what was going on. Why was Matthew dressed in casual clothes? Why wasn't he on his way to the office? What was he doing in her bedroom? Her mind was flooded with questions, but she couldn't bring herself to ask any. She just stared at him. Matthew, of course, noticed the confusion on her face and gave a brief explanation. He said that since she didn't want to go to the hospital, he would stay home and take care of her until she got better. Julia felt like she had set a trap for herself. She had been trying to avoid Matthew by pretending to be sick, and now she was going to be stuck with him? Desperately, she told him he didn't have to stay just to watch over her, insisting that she would be fine. She urged him to go to the company, but he refused, saying she was his responsibility. His parents had specifically entrusted her care to him, and he was answerable to them. Julia felt like pulling her hair out. Matthew always had a way of ruining her plans. She stopped insisting that he leave, not wanting to seem suspicious. It was clear he had already made up his mind, and there was no convincing him otherwise. So she had no choice but to keep pretending to be sick. She immediately regretted this plan of hers. Matthew tenderly wiped her face with a warm towel, placed a fresh one on her forehead, and then left the room. Julia just lay in bed, totally confused. Never in her life did she think Matthew could be this gentle and caring. After a while, he returned with a bowl of soup. He helped her sit up and spoon-fed her gently, blowing on each scoop before bringing it to her lips. The soup was really nice. Julia hadn't thought Matthew could even boil water, let alone make such a good soup. Throughout the day, he kept shocking her with his caring and considerate nature. He took really good care of her, even preparing lunch and feeding her himself. Julia found herself zoning in and out, switching between pretending to be sick and being utterly shell-shocked by Matthew's odd behavior. She started feeling guilty for deceiving him. The way he was acting was overwhelming. And on top of that, she feared he might eventually realize she had been faking it. If he found out she had tricked him into missing work just to fool him, he would most likely be furious. After sleeping most of the day, she woke up in the evening and told Matthew she was feeling much better. She thanked him and assured him she would be able to resume her work the next day. Julia decided she needed to think of a different plan to avoid Matthew. Pretending to be sick had completely backfired. The next morning, Julia woke up early as usual and started working on her chores. She was busy in the kitchen when her phone rang. Since it was in her pocket, she quickly pulled it out. She was surprised when she saw the caller ID. Why was Matthew calling her? She debated whether to answer the call or just go up to his room. In the end, she decided to pick up instead of walking into the unknown. As soon as she answered, she heard some labored coughing on the other end. Then Matthew spoke weakly, explaining that he wasn't feeling well. He said he felt weak and feverish and wouldn't be able to go to the company today. Julia was so confused. What kind of coincidence was this? She rushed upstairs to Matthew's bedroom to confirm, and sure enough, he was in bed, looking weak and helpless. Julia didn't even know how to handle the situation. She started massively regretting pretending to be sick yesterday. He had taken such good care of her. Now she was obliged to return the favor. She offered the very same suggestions Matthew had given her yesterday, taking him to the hospital, calling a doctor, or getting him some medicine. But he turned all of them down, saying all he needed was enough rest. Julia's alarm bells started going off. That was exactly what she had said yesterday. In fact, this whole scenario felt like a replay of the previous day. Only this time, the roles were reversed, and he was the sick one. But the thing was, Julia knew she had never been sick. She wondered if Matthew was pretending too. She walked closer to him and placed her hand on his forehead to check for a fever, but his temperature seemed completely normal. "You're not feverish," Julia pointed out. "Are you a doctor?" "You don't understand the pain I'm going through," Matthew said weakly. "I'm not a doctor, but I can call one for you," Julia suggested again. She knew his doctors. "And why would you do that?" Matthew asked. "When you were sick, I went out of my way to take care of you. Now that I'm sick, you want to call someone else to take care of me? Is that fair?" Julia knew he was right, but this only made her suspicions grow stronger. She believed Matthew was most likely pretending to be sick just to make her take care of him as compensation for what he had done for her yesterday. She couldn't accuse him, though, because she wasn't sure if he knew she had been pretending. If she confronted him, she might end up incriminating herself. So she had only one option: to play along. As Julia applied warm compresses on Matthew, she realized just how ridiculous he must have felt doing the same for her yesterday. She hadn't had a fever, yet he still applied warm compresses to her. Now that she thought about it, she wondered why he never pointed that out. It didn't make sense. After the compresses, Julia went to prepare some warm soup for him. Once it was ready, she brought it to his room and handed it over, but he said he was too weak and that she would have to feed him. Julia didn't object. At this point, she realized Matthew was dead set on making her do everything he had done for her yesterday. She decided to just comply and hope his pretense ended soon. Julia had to take care of Matthew the whole day. When night came, he apparently still hadn't gotten any better. At bedtime, he told her he couldn't sleep alone because he might need her help with something, like going to the bathroom, or his condition could suddenly worsen and he would need assistance. He insisted that Julia spend the night on the couch in his bedroom, despite her attempts to suggest sleeping in the room right across from his. He argued that his health was very important and that it was her responsibility to take care of him. He even said his parents wouldn't be happy if she neglected him. After so much gaslighting from him, Julia gave up and agreed. The couch was very uncomfortable for her. She had gotten used to the enormous bed in her bedroom downstairs. She just hoped this torturous night would end and that Matthew would snap out of his state by morning. When Julia woke up, she was in a very warm bed. It took her some time to gather her thoughts before she quickly opened her eyes, and the sight of Matthew's face right next to hers made her jump right out of bed. Julia couldn't understand how she had gotten into the bed. She kept looking between the bed and the couch, where her blanket was still lying. She had no memory of moving, and she had never been a sleepwalker. The only plausible explanation was that someone had carried her from the couch to the bed. But it was hard, practically impossible, to believe Matthew could have done that. There was no way she was going to ask him, so she decided to sneak out and pretend the whole ordeal never happened. She was just glad he hadn't woken up yet. Later, when he did wake up, he didn't mention anything about their shared bed situation, so Julia ignored it as well. But her day was basically a repeat of the previous one. Matthew was still acting sickly, behaving like a complete child who needed his mother for everything. Julia could have never imagined that the authoritative and demeaning Matthew she had known could be this childish and dependent. When she took his lunch upstairs, he said he wanted to eat in the living room. So Julia had to help him downstairs, where he still insisted that she feed him as he lay weakly on the couch. Julia was doing just that when the doorbell rang. That was a rare occurrence here. She wondered who it could be. She went over to open the door, and there stood Nancy, holding some documents. It was clear she was displeased to see Julia. Without a word, Nancy walked directly into the house after giving Julia a demeaning look. Julia stood at the entrance for a moment, staring at Nancy as she made her way toward the living room before closing the door and following her inside. When Julia entered the living room, she was shocked by the sight in front of her. She couldn't believe her eyes. It all seemed like a joke. Matthew was sitting upright on the couch, going through some documents as he signed them, issuing authoritative instructions to Nancy. He didn't sound sick at all. In fact, his weak, sickly voice was completely gone. What she heard instead was the bossy, commanding Matthew she knew all too well. He looked so healthy and agile that Julia thought she was looking at someone else. Wasn't he just weak and helpless a few moments ago? Matthew finished signing the papers, gave Nancy a few more instructions, and told her to return to the company immediately. He had noticed Julia standing there, clearly stunned, but he didn't seem to care. As soon as Nancy walked out, Matthew grabbed the blanket he had been wrapped in earlier, covered himself again, and lay down, suddenly looking sickly and weak once more. Julia couldn't believe her eyes. He was truly shameless. He even let out a few weak coughs before looking at her. "Stop standing there idly and get back to feeding me my lunch," he said, acting like a dying man. Julia felt insulted. So she had been right all along. He had been pretending to be sick, and she had been running around taking care of him like a fool. Why in the world would a grown, working man pretend to be sick, except to make her life miserable? "You must be crazy if you think I'll feed you with my hands," Julia snapped. "If you can hold a pen to sign documents, I'm sure you can hold your own spoon and feed yourself. I knew you were just pretending to be sick." "What kind of person does that?" "I'm the exact kind of person you are," Matthew retorted as he sat up. "Didn't you also pretend to be sick just the day before?" he accused. Julia felt a little guilty. So he had known all along. "At least I was only sick for half a day," she pointed out defensively. "You've been pretending since yesterday, and you're still at it. So what?" Matthew said shamelessly. "Just because you started the game doesn't mean you get to decide how long it lasts. I'll be sick for as long as I like, and you have to take care of me. I agree that I started this, but you caused it. How do you expect me to trek to the office with your meals twice a day, let alone your other torturous requests? Julia argued. Oh, so you just want to stay at home all day doing nothing, he accused. Oh, please. I don't have a problem doing all the housework and cooking for you, Julia shot back. I'm just tired of having to take your meals to the company. If you don't want your food in any vehicle, then you'll have to eat breakfast here before going to work and drive home for lunch, because there's no way I'm trekking to the company. Fine, Matthew responded. Julia thought she had misheard him. What did you say? She asked. I said fine. I'll have breakfast here and drive home for lunch, he repeated. Julia was completely shocked. She thought she must have imagined it, but he was clear. She wondered if he was playing games with her. Matthew was never the type to relent, but he had been surprising her a lot lately with his recent actions. Now, come here and resume feeding me before I change my mind, he warned. Julia, unsure why he insisted on being spoon-fed like a child, reluctantly returned to his side. The next day, Matthew kept his word. He had breakfast at home and returned for lunch before heading back to the office. This continued for days. Julia joined him for each meal, and he brought back snacks for her every day. He no longer made things difficult for her, and they started getting closer. A decent friendship quickly developed between them. Matthew even lent her a hand around the house when he came home, and they had long conversations about different things. They also laughed about their past moments when they had been at each other's throats. One weekend, they were cooking in the kitchen when Julia started talking about her friend. You know, my friend Sarah has some of the wildest theories ever, she said. When I told her about how you were treating me at the office and how you were cordial with everyone else, she said it's because you're in love with me and that you were just trying hard to fight off your feelings. Either that, or you didn't know how to express them, or maybe you were just afraid to. Julia laughed out loud at the ridiculous thought, but she soon realized she was the only one laughing. She looked toward Matthew, but he was just quietly staring at her. Julia felt rather awkward. Was there something on her face? Was her joke bad? Was he offended? She wondered. What? She asked awkwardly. Matthew was silent for a moment before he finally spoke. I'm just surprised. You're so dumb. I didn't expect you'd have smart friends, he said, keeping his eyes on her. Julia immediately got defensive. She was about to reprimand him for calling her dumb, but her words died in her throat when she realized what he meant. He had called her dumb and said her friends were smart. Did that mean Sarah was right? That he actually had feelings for her? Was she dumb for not seeing it and for not believing Sarah? Julia stood there in shock, staring at Matthew. The two of them were completely silent, their earlier lively conversation and laughter replaced by an eerie stillness. Neither of them knew how long they had been standing there when the doorbell suddenly rang, sounding louder than ever in the silence. Julia took it as an opportunity to escape the awkward moment. She rushed to the front door and was shocked to see who was on the other side. Matthew's parents had somehow returned to the country. They said they had cut their trip short because they missed home and had arrived yesterday. But the house didn't feel the same without Julia, so they had come to take her. Matthew and Julia remained unusually quiet, but Christine and Anthony didn't ask any questions. It was as if they didn't even notice the tension. They didn't stay long, either. One would think, after being away for so long, they would sit down and chat with their son, but that didn't happen. Christine simply ushered Julia to go pack her things. Julia had imagined this moment so many times before and always thought she would be the happiest person alive when she finally moved back in with Christine and Anthony. But now that it was happening, she felt empty, like she was leaving a big part of her life behind. Packing her bags felt torturous. Matthew was nowhere to be seen when she left with his parents. They said he had gone up to his bedroom, claiming he had work to do and didn't want any disturbances. She didn't even get to say goodbye. Days went by, and not a single moment passed without Julia thinking of Matthew. Not being able to see or hear him felt like torture. She found herself wishing Christine and Anthony hadn't come back so soon, because she missed it all. She missed his annoying orders. She missed cooking for him and taking his meals to the office. She even missed his ridiculous, made-up reasons to have her around. Now, more than ever, She understood why he had acted so strangely, coming up with any excuse to have her at the office. She just wished that if he truly loved her, he would come and take her back soon, because she yearned to be with him again. Christine and Anthony noticed Julia's low spirits, but they didn't ask any questions. In fact, they acted as if they knew nothing. Meanwhile, Matthew was having an even rougher time. He couldn't function properly. He was a known workaholic, but not even work could distract him now. He imagined Julia everywhere he looked. He kept hoping to see her open his office door, walking in with that simple blue uniform that made her look so down-to-earth and beautiful as she carried his food package. Going home was no longer enjoyable because he knew he wouldn't see her beautiful, playful smile as she waited for him. Every evening, he came home hoping to see her. He yearned for her presence. Matthew wondered how he had even been living before he met her, because now, it seemed impossible to survive without her. He could still recall the first day he met her. His father had recently handed over the company to him after stepping down to enjoy his retirement. His father's personal assistant had stayed on for a few weeks to help Matthew settle in, but from the very beginning, the man had made it clear that he intended to retire soon as well. Being an older man, it was understandable. Before leaving, he had arranged interviews for a new personal assistant. Matthew had given him full permission to handle the process, knowing he had worked at the company for a long time and would choose the best candidate for the job. Matthew had only one request. He wanted a male personal assistant. He was well aware of the undue attention he often received from women, and he didn't want any workplace drama interfering with his work. So when Julia was introduced to him as his new assistant, he was immediately displeased. His only request had been that the candidate be male, which she clearly wasn't. In fact, he had specifically asked that only men be shortlisted. He had been very clear. But his father's old assistant was persistent. He insisted that Julia was the best candidate for the job. He asked Matthew to give her a chance, assuring him that Julia was very professional and would never mix work with love. She wouldn't fall for him at all. Matthew took this as a challenge. He wanted to prove the old man wrong, to show that any woman could fall for him. So he agreed to keep Julia. As the days went by, he never received any mixed signals from her. She was always professional and never seemed the least bit charmed by his presence. Over time, this began to agitate Matthew, and without realizing it, he started making her do tasks that would keep him on her mind. His demands became weirder and more frustrating, pushing Julia to her limits for months, until she finally lost it and lashed out at him. That day, after she stormed out, Matthew expected her to come back, either to apologize or to beg for her job. But that never happened. He had been more than willing to forgive her and rehire her, yet she never showed up. He sent people to search for her everywhere, but all his efforts were in vain. It frustrated him beyond words, and it seemed like there was no way he would ever find her. In the end, his attempts to make her fall for him had backfired, because now, he was the one trapped. When he saw her at his parents' house, his emotions were all over the place. He was angry that he had searched for her so long when she had been right under his nose the whole time. But at the same time, he was relieved that she was safe, and happy that he had finally found her. Of course, he concealed his joy. The day his parents asked her to move in with him, he was genuinely happy. Seeing her every day, even though they bickered most of the time, made him feel fulfilled. Watching his parents take her away was the hardest thing. Now he wished he had stopped them. He regretted locking himself up in his room as they took her away. His own parents had become the enemies of his love life, and it was beginning to greatly irritate him. After yet another completely unproductive day at the office, Matthew decided to act on his burning thoughts. He left in the middle of a busy workday and drove straight to his parents' house. Julia was shocked to see him. He looked troubled. Neither of them spoke. There wasn't even a chance to, as Matthew's parents were all over the place, keeping them from having a private moment. All four of them sat in the living room. Anthony and Christine kept going on and on about different stories from their vacation, laughing to themselves as if they were completely unaware of the tense silence between Matthew and Julia. After what felt like forever, with only his parents' chatter filling the room, Matthew's patience started to wear thin. By the way, son, what are you doing here in the middle of a busy workday? I hope you aren't mishandling the company. You need to go back right now, his mother said, and his father immediately supported her. It became clear to Matthew that his parents were deliberately trying to frustrate him. They most likely knew why he was here and were trying to push him out just to get a reaction out of him. He knew them too well. They were obviously up to something. But he hadn't come here for nothing. Matthew stood up, walked over to Julia, grabbed her hand, and started pulling her along. Julia was caught off guard, but she didn't protest. Christine, on the other hand, did. She quickly got up and blocked their way. Excuse me, where do you think you're going with her? I asked you to leave, not her, she pointed out. I'm leaving with her, Matthew stated firmly. And why is that? Where are you taking her? His father asked. Dad, I have something important to discuss with her. I'll bring her back later, Matthew responded. And what exactly is so important that you can't say it in our presence? His mother questioned suspiciously. At this point, Matthew realized his own parents were ganging up on him. Mom, ever heard of privacy? Why are you two trying to interfere in a matter between two people? We have something important to discuss, and old people shouldn't be involved, he said in frustration. But his parents weren't having any of it. Listen, boy, don't think we don't know how you were mistreating Julia while we were gone. We no longer trust your intentions toward her, so she's not going anywhere with you. We had someone watching you too and reporting everything to us, Anthony stated authoritatively. Both Julia and Matthew were stunned. Matthew then acknowledged his past actions toward Julia, adding that he had already apologized and that she had forgiven him, which was indeed true. Julia and I are on good terms now, and we love each other. So if you could please stop meddling in our business, Matthew declared, desperately trying to get his parents off his back. Julia was shocked by his words. But his parents? They didn't seem surprised at all. Why are you speaking for her? Did she tell you that she loves you? Christine challenged. Matthew suddenly realized his mother was right. Julia hadn't said anything about love to him. Whether she loves me or not doesn't matter. All that matters is that I love her, and I plan to prove that to her. So, if you two could please stop being obstacles to my progress and let us leave, Matthew explained. Leave to go where? Are you okay? His father questioned. You just walked into our house, grabbed our daughter, and now you want to take her to who knows where just because you want to prove your love? Didn't you have 7 months of working closely with her and nearly a month of living under the same roof to do that? How come you need more time? How can you just come here, take our daughter, and expect us not to say anything? Is that the proper way of doing things? Anthony added. And what exactly is the right way? Matthew snapped in frustration. You are finally asking the right questions, like any ignorant person should, Anthony remarked. If you have an interest in our daughter and want to take her with you, you must bring your people, introduce yourself properly, and make your intentions and plans for her clear. That is what I did before taking your mother out of her father's house, he explained, shocking Matthew. At this point, Julia remained completely silent, watching the entire ordeal unfold with a blank expression of total confusion. Dad, what do you mean I should bring my people? You're my parents. Can't you just analyze the whole situation and be done with it? Matthew asked in frustration. His parents were honestly sounding ridiculous. We may be your parents, but in this case, we can only represent one child, and that is our daughter, Christine said firmly. In fact, we do not acknowledge you in this matter. You'll have to go find your uncles to represent you because, as far as we're concerned, we do not know you. Now leave on your own, the very same way you came, she ordered. Matthew stomped out of his parents' house, seething with rage. Why were they making things so hard for him? Just a few weeks ago, they had practically left Julia entirely in his care. But now, taking her out was suddenly a problem? He spent the rest of the day tracking down his uncles and explaining everything to them. Matthew wanted them to go with him to his parents' house immediately, but he knew they had their own busy schedules. He managed to convince them to join him the very next day, though they couldn't help but mock him for getting the tough in-laws treatment from his own parents. It was truly odd and completely ridiculous. Matthew couldn't wait for the next day. He wanted to have Julia back with him. He yearned to hear her voice, so he decided to call her. but his mother was the one who answered the phone. Matthew was so frustrated. His parents had become thorns in his flesh. The night felt unusually longer than any other. Julia was in her bedroom, finding it hard to fall asleep because she was caught up in so many emotions. As an orphan with no family relations, she had never thought she would experience the thrill of having the man she loved officially come to ask for permission to be with her and pay her bride price. Julia didn't have parents, so this was never a dream of hers. She knew it was impossible. It was just something she greatly admired. The experience today, where she got to watch Anthony and Christine stand up for her and constantly refer to her as their daughter, left her feeling so emotional. She didn't understand why they were doing all that, but it meant so much to her. Never in her life had she felt as valuable as she did at that moment. Matthew boldly declaring his love for her in front of his parents was another thing that moved her. The whole turn of events felt like a dream, and she never wanted to wake up from it. The sun had barely risen when Matthew got ready and drove to each of his uncle's homes to personally pick them up and take them to his parents' house. Upon arrival, Christine happily welcomed them since they were practically already family, but she stopped Matthew at the entrance. "What is it this time?" he complained. "Why in the world have you come to your potential in-laws' house empty-handed? Is this whole thing a joke to you? Where are the gifts you'll present to us?" she inquired. "Mom, is that really necessary?" Matthew begged. "It is very necessary. In fact, it's the only way you'll be allowed into this house. Get out and go sort yourself out," she ordered. Matthew was irritated. He was tired of his parents' schemes. He vowed to do everything possible to get Julia out of this house and make sure they wouldn't set eyes on her for a long time. But for now, he had to do everything they wanted. Buying gifts wasn't a problem at all. In fact, his mother had just helped remind him. He had been so focused on taking Julia with him that he forgot basic formalities. Matthew went all out in getting gifts. Every store he visited got busy packing, decorating, and delivering the gifts he bought. He got so many things that soon enough, Julia's room was filled to the brim with gifts, as he made sure most of the things he bought were for her. When he was finally allowed in after sending the gifts, he saw his parents happily conversing with his uncles, and this kind of irritated him. This was no family reunion. He had come here for a reason, and he wanted that to be the main focus. Fortunately, the conversation soon shifted to the main reason for their gathering. Matthew's uncles were completely in character despite how strange this whole ordeal was. They made their intentions known and spoke highly of Matthew. Christine and Anthony were in character, too. They invited Julia to come and verify whether she knew Matthew and what her opinion was on his proposal. Matthew's attention perked up. He realized that up until this moment, it had been him moving around, laying claims on her, and he hadn't actually heard her opinion on the whole thing. Julia looked really beautiful. She was dressed in a casual traditional dress. Matthew couldn't stop admiring her, and even his uncles commented on it. When Julia was asked to give her consent for the way forward, she could barely get any words out. She was so shy that all she could do was nod her head in affirmation, and that was a good enough answer for everyone. Matthew was really relieved as well. At least he got confirmation for what he had been fighting for. All the formalities were concluded successfully, and Matthew's parents didn't give him any trouble so far. They agreed to the union and were very happy. "Now that I have done everything you wanted, can I take Julia back to our house in peace?" Matthew asked, wanting to make everything clear. But it seemed he was completely mistaken. "What do you mean by you want to take her to your house?" "Take her there, as what?" Christine inquired, and Matthew knew this could only mean more trouble. "As my fiancé, of course. I've done everything you asked of me," he defended. "All you have done is make your intentions known to us. We have agreed to accept your relationship with her, but that doesn't mean you get to take her to your house. We will not allow you to violate her purity like that. You have to fully conclude all the necessary formalities before taking her," his mother explained. "Mom, what is this again? What do you mean by I'll violate her? You didn't seem to care about that when you asked her to come live with me just a few weeks back," Matthew accused. "We only allowed you to take her because we didn't know your true intentions toward her. You two were always bickering all over the house like siblings, not lovers. We didn't know that you viewed her as a woman. Now we know better. You can only take her to your house in the proper way, Christine asserted. And what exactly is this proper way? You asked me to bring my people. I've brought my uncles. What else is remaining? Matthew asked in frustration. The only proper way is marriage. Ask your uncles whether their in-laws allowed them to take their wives home without a recognized marriage arrangement. I, myself, had to properly marry your mother before bringing her to my house, and the same will apply to you. Marriage is the condition, Anthony commanded. At this point, Matthew is ready and willing to do anything to get his parents off his back and leave with Julia. That is not a problem. In fact, I'll take her to the courthouse right now to legalize our marriage, he said. But this didn't sit well with his mother at all. Excuse me? Did you just talk about a court marriage? Are you okay? Don't you know that it's every girl's dream to have a grand wedding? How dare you suggest a court marriage, as if we can't afford to throw a big weddings? Christine scolded. Julia was just as confused as she had been yesterday as she watched the parents and son bickering. Christine was right. She had, in fact, dreamed of having a nice wedding. But weddings are only enjoyable for people who have family and friends to celebrate with. She had only a small circle of friends, and she wasn't even close to most of them. She didn't want to be all alone on her wedding day, so the idea of a court wedding was just fine by her. But Christine had other plans. Mom, this big wedding you're talking about sounds like something that will take ages, and I'm not liking the thought of it, Matthew voiced. It won't take that long. I can squeeze it to happen in about a month or two, Christine explained. Just as Matthew was about to protest that ridiculous duration, the doorbell rang, and his mother excitedly rushed to open it. Christine came back in with a smart, professional-looking woman whom she introduced as a wedding planner. No one had seen her make any calls, so it was obvious that she had premeditated and planned everything. Julia was asked to choose between a traditional wedding and a white wedding, and she chose to have a traditional wedding. When it came to selecting a date for the ceremony, Matthew insisted that it be this very weekend, and he sounded ridiculous. The wedding planner informed him that it would be impossible to perfect a wedding of this scale in such a short time. She said she would need at least 3 weeks, but Matthew insisted that they start preparing the guest list and sending out invitations immediately because he wouldn't accept anything beyond 2 weeks. The wedding came as a shock to many people, but no one planned to miss the grand occasion. It was a Wendell wedding, after all. The 2 weeks were extremely busy for the whole family. There was a lot to plan. Christine asked Julia to invite her friend Sarah to live with them to keep her company. Julia was so grateful for this. She felt much better having her around. Matthew was allowed to take Julia out only once, under the promise of bringing her back home on time. He used that moment to officially propose to her. Julia was caught off guard. She had never expected Matthew to propose. She had already agreed to marry him, and their wedding was practically just a few days away. It was so considerate of him to propose. Julia was so happy. The day of the grand wedding soon came, and there were so many guests. Christine had really gone all out, inviting every family member, their workmates, business partners, friends, and more. Julia didn't know most of the guests, but her friends, especially those from college and those she grew up with at the orphanage, came, which made her feel more comfortable. She even saw some familiar workmates, including Nancy, and they all seemed happy for her. Matthew's friends also came to support him. His relatives were really welcoming and kind toward Julia. Christine had made sure to put in a good word for her. Christine and Anthony were the most supportive. They recognized her as their daughter in front of everyone and made their stand as the parents of the bride. Julia felt so much love. Her emotions were all over the place. The ceremony progressed so well. It was grand, and Julia was surprised that so many people were able to attend on such short notice. Their wedding had been the talk of the city for days before it even happened. People ate, drank, and danced themselves into the night. Julia was exhausted, so when Matthew suggested that they sneak out of the party, she was more than happy to oblige. With help from some of their friends, the newlyweds slipped away, drove off, and finally got their long-awaited private moment together. No parents to interfere. And they surely made great use of it.